Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This semester is zooming by. This is week 5. But we're in for a real treat today. Our speaker, of course, I think almost everybody here knows her, Barbara Oberlander, Emeritus Professor of History from Santa Fe. She's spoken on so many interesting people in history. And First Ladies is kind of one of her specialties. So in the, in the sequence of the New Deal that we've been covering, Eleanor was there from the beginning and saw the whole thing play out and was a big influencer. And that's what Barbara's going to tell us about today. So I'll just turn it over to Barbara.
Yes. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Ron, and thank you for allowing me to talk about one of my favorite first ladies, Eleanor Roosevelt. When Eleanor Roosevelt became First Lady in 1933, she was not quite 50 years old. She had already established herself as a strong, independent woman, a woman of great achievement. She was a political force in her own right before she became First Lady. As a young woman, she had worked in settlement houses with immigrants. She had become involved with the National Consumers League, trying to secure better hours and working conditions for women and children. After she married in 1905 to her fifth cousin, once removed, Franklin Roosevelt, she quickly had a succession of children in barely 10 years. Her life changed, and for a while she was occupied with domestic issues and trying to ward off the very strong influence of her mother-in-law. But once it became clear that theirs was not going to be a traditional marriage, and Eleanor Roosevelt found out, to her horror, about Franklin Roosevelt's affair with the social secretary that she herself had chosen, it was evident to her that she would need to find her identity outside the marriage as well as in. And so she became involved in Democratic politics. She was very friendly with a number of influential women, including Molly Dewson. And after Roosevelt became stricken with polio in 1921, Eleanor Roosevelt was the person who actually campaigned for him around the state when he ran for governor. And here is a very nice photo of Roosevelt and his family when he was governor. That's his son, James, on the far right, and James's wife and James's mother-in-law. You will notice, of course, that Franklin Roosevelt is seated. I suspect everyone is aware that once Roosevelt was stricken with polio, he never was able to really walk again without major supports. Yet the public, amazingly enough, did not necessarily realize that. And even when he became president, many people did not understand that we had a president who was essentially confined to a wheelchair or had to be carried from one place to another. So Eleanor Roosevelt, having made her peace with this non traditional marriage, became his surrogate in terms of political campaigning and going around the state. She, as I said, became very involved with the state Democratic Party. She led the delegation to the Democratic National Convention. She headed up the women's campaign for the Democrats in 1928. And then in 1932, when FDR ran for the presidency, she was even more important. She helped to coordinate the activities of the women's division of the Democratic National Party, and that meant getting thousands of female precinct workers out there, making sure that Roosevelt got elected. And there's a picture from the inauguration. In 1933, you will see that he is standing, Roosevelt is standing, holding on to the arm of his son, which is the way it always was. Despite all her accomplishments, she was very nervous about becoming First Lady and very concerned that she was going to lose her vocation, her identity, her sense of self in this role in which most First Ladies sat quietly while their husbands talked and smiled. And she did not want that for herself. She told FDR of her fears, and he responded with his usual sense of lightness, humor, and actually wrote her a little tiny poem about this. Did my Eleanor relate all the sad and awful fate of the miserable lives lived by Washington wives? And he teased her about that. She was immediately thrown into all the social gatherings that surround the First Lady. And what you have here, for those of you who are interested in such things, is a collection of her inaugural gowns. The one she wore to the very first inauguration is the third one from the left. She attended the inaugural festivities, and then immediately there was a reception for 3,000 guests who came to the White House, and she had to shake their hands and say something to each person. And after that, there was a family dinner, and then there were all these ceremonies, and she was concerned. But her concerns really were not valid, because we are dealing with a woman who came with an agenda. This is the book that was published to mark Eleanor Roosevelt becoming First Lady. It is a collection of her past speeches and columns and letters and whatever. It's 40,000 words. And it's called It's Up to the Women, and title that tells you a lot. This is what she said. It is important that women think beyond the mere moment through which we are passing and acquaint ourselves with all phases of life and conditions in our own country. I think we shall have fulfilled our mission well if, when our time comes to give up active work in the world, we can say we never saw a wrong without trying to right it. We never intentionally left unhappiness where a little effort would have turned it into happiness. She was convinced that women would play a major role in overcoming the Great Depression, that their leadership was essential, and she was determined to lead a movement for social justice. within the New Deal. It became apparent to her that women's issues were crucial, and she wanted to bring them to the forefront. So, this remarkable woman held her first press conference within 48 hours of the inauguration. And here it is, March 6, 1933. You can see what's interesting about this press conference: only female reporters were invited. And she passed out a box of chocolate candy to them. But this was going to be her pattern. Press conferences, can you believe it? 348 press conferences in 12 years, all for women reporters. And she would often bring prominent women to talk about the major issues in American society. When she traveled, as you will soon see, she often had women reporters with her. Not only this, but she actively campaigned for more women in government positions. 1933, women had the vote, but they weren't really being elected to offices. So it was very, very important that she lobby for women to be appointed to government positions. And boy, did she lobby. She would look at the list of appointments that were proposed, and if there weren't women on the list, well, she'd have a conversation with FDR, and those conversations are famous. She was working with Molly Dewson, who, as I mentioned, was head of the women's division of the Democratic National Party, and they together made sure that thousands of women were appointed to government offices, particularly in the post offices, and then they pulled off a coup. The first woman in the cabinet, the first woman Secretary of Labor, the longest serving Secretary of Labor we've ever had, Frances Perkins. Now, she was not unknown to Franklin Roosevelt. She had served as head of the Industrial Commission in New York. And Frances Perkins was also a woman with an agenda. Before she accepted the role of being Secretary of Labor, she went to Roosevelt and said, "This is what I want to do. I want to have unemployment insurance. I want to have restrictions on child labor and women labor. I want to have safety conditions. I want to have old age employment insurance. If you don't like this, I'm not the person for this job." Can you imagine going to the president-elect and saying, "This is what I want, and if you don't agree with me, I'm out"? But that's what Frances Perkins did. And thank you, Frances Perkins. I suspect that every single one of us in this room benefits from her policies. So, women's issues. And Eleanor Roosevelt was particularly sensitive to the lack of inclusion in certain New Deal programs. For example, you heard a couple of weeks ago about the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put young men to work on conservation projects. But there were lots of young women. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, quote, "What about the women? As a group, women have been neglected in comparison with others, and throughout this depression have had the hardest time of all." And she suggested that there would be a program for women similar to men, that they set up camps. And this was the first one, Camp Terra at Bear Mountain, New York. It was set up under temporary emergency relief, and it began in 1933 with 17 young women from New York. The idea was that you would have camps around the country and they would provide young women with jobs and training. They did not get rich off these jobs, believe me, 56 to 70 hours a week work in return for $5 a month spending money. They were generally located in facilities that were already standing, like abandoned camps, and they worked on forest projects, just like the CCC. They worked in canneries. They took cooking classes. They made supplies for hospitals, for newborn babies, a whole variety of things. There were about 100 of these camps, and they were called she camps to go with the CCC camps for young men. But Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't finished with young people. There were millions of them that were unemployed. And she believed the government needed to have a special program just for America's youth. And she approached Roosevelt at the time she often chose, just as he was about to go to sleep. And she suggested that a program be started that would provide these special training opportunities for young people. And as she described it, she said, you know, there might be some opposition because remember the 1930s and remember the Hitler Youth and what that kind of training looked like. And Americans were seeing newsreels about this. Roosevelt said, I understand there might be some opposition, but is it the right thing to do? And she said, Franklin, it is the right thing to do. We must do it. So here are some more photos of the camps for young women, the she camps. Oops. This was a camp in one of my favorite states, Maine. And now you see the posters for what was created for young people. It was called the National Youth Administration. And it's interesting that the posters that kept popping up in my Google search are from Illinois. And they had different posters, as you can see, for girls and boys. So this was a very important program. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt not only came up with some new ideas for programs during the Depression, but she also functioned in a very important way. She was an observer in capital letters. She was the eyes and ears for Roosevelt. Obviously, he could not travel easily, and somebody had to. Somebody had to travel around the country and see what was really happening. I mean, you sat in Congress, you sat in the White House, and you heard, but you didn't see. Eleanor Roosevelt saw. I want you to know that in the first year, she traveled 40,000 miles in the United States, going to rural areas, going to Appalachia, going to urban slums, going to coal mines, going to Indian reservations. She went everywhere. She was called, in fact, Eleanor Everywhere. One of the papers in Washington had a tongue-in-cheek headline, Eleanor Roosevelt sleeps in the White House, because she was never there. But what did she see? And she would come back and tell Roosevelt the truth. And he knew he could count on her. His advisors said, oh, yes, this is working well. But Eleanor Roosevelt saw and told him the truth. She went to coal mines. She went to WPA, the Works Progress Administration project. Here she is in Des Moines, and you can see she wants to know everything that's going on. She went to Puerto Rico. Another shot of her in Puerto Rico, and see the women behind her? Those are the women reporters who accompanied her to Puerto Rico. She went to Appalachia and saw rural poverty that nobody could quite imagine. And that was important. It was so important, bringing back what the country was really like. Of course, the New Deal had its critics, and you heard about many of them last week. But for the majority of Americans, this woman provided the human face of the New Deal. Not just the legislation and the programs, but she was a symbol of concern, of the spirit of the New Deal in many ways. She promoted the New Deal, she promoted programs, but she also knew that Americans needed hope and courage to get through this time. And she was going to show them that someone cared. Thousands of people wrote letters to her, personal letters, asking for help, asking for her to buy products, asking for financial assistance. And all of those letters were responded to. And this woman, who never had a course in media, boy, did she know how to use it. She instinctively realized that she needed to communicate with the American people. And it started with a column called My Day in 1935, and it went through 1962, and it reached millions of people every single day. She wrote about her day, whether she had gone to a hospital to visit people, or she had had a lunch or a dinner, or what she had seen in Kentucky and things that were happening on the world stage. It was so important because through My Day, and by the way, she was also on the radio, she compressed that distance between the White House and the people. And that was a special talent that she had that was so very important to the New Deal. There's no doubt about it. She had certain favorite projects, and this is one of them. Some of you may know that under the Works Project Administration, there was a unique creative program that I just love. It was a program to bring books to the hill country of Appalachia. And many of these people who lived in remote areas had no access to books. Some of them could not read. These were poor, very poor remote areas. And what we have is something called the horseback librarians. And under this project, literally, women were hired to get on horses, or in some cases, mules, and to go into these distant areas. We're talking about 10,000 square miles of eastern Kentucky, an area that was very hard hit by the Depression. It was a poor state to begin with, and it became poorer. High illiteracy rate. So many of the books that were brought were essentially picture books that people could look at. It was incredible. It required local participation. In other words, they gathered books and people gave books from all over the country. And whatever facility they could find, a church, a store, an abandoned building, is where they housed the books. And then the writers came, and twice a month they made their deliveries. They got $28 a month in pay, and it served at its height 50,000 families. It's amazing. 1,000 women were hired and employed. It was a program that was near and dear to Eleanor's heart. She advocated for this program and she really believed in it. There are several wonderful novels written about this program, by the way, for those of you who are readers, so I would recommend them. But she had another project. It's called Arthurdale. It was established in 1933 under the Federal Homestead Act, and it was one of several model plan communities, as you can see from the plaque. It was in West Virginia, close to a place called Scott's Run. And one of Eleanor Roosevelt's very close friends, Lorena Hickok, otherwise known as Hick, who was a reporter, had gone to Scott's Run in West Virginia. Now, West Virginia was mining country, but many of the miners in West Virginia had been unemployed for years and years and years. And when Lorena Hickok, who was a reporter who had gone all over, went there, she was horrified at what she saw. And she said to Eleanor Roosevelt, "You have to come and see for yourself." Eleanor Roosevelt could not believe how people were living in this community. They were living in places that she said were, quote, unfit for human habitation. They were shacks covered in coal dust. She said everything was covered in coal dust. She didn't think these people could ever get clean. She found one-room shacks where whole families were sleeping on one bed, or there were some kids on rags on the floor. Someone described watching her at one of these visits, and Eleanor Roosevelt had the baby on her lap, and she's talking to the woman and looking around. And she could not stand the sight of this in the United States of America. And so she went back, and who did she talk to? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he said, "We have a program. There's a little known program that can help with this." And it was called the Subsistence Homestead Division. What an unexciting name. The Subsistence Homestead Division? What was that? And it turned out that this was a program that was hidden in the National Industrial Recovery Act to actually relocate people from very poor areas to other places and to help them economically and to provide decent housing for them. The government would give low interest loans to these people, and eventually the idea was that they would buy the houses that were built for them. Eleanor Roosevelt became an incredible advocate and believer in this program. Here she is visiting the construction site. This one was called Arthurdale because it was named after the man that the government bought the property from. They bought 1,200 acres for about $45,000. And they started putting up homes. These were prefab little, in a sense, Cape Cod homes from my home state of Massachusetts. They were moved all the way from Massachusetts to West Virginia. These were the Arthurdale homesteaders, the initial group, and Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in their choice. Now, you will not see any faces of color because I'm sad to tell you that the Arthurdale homesteaders did not want immigrants. They did not want people of color. They did not want Jewish people in this development. Eleanor Roosevelt was appalled, but she accepted it as a first step. Here she is again visiting Arthurdale. She went almost every year. And they set up some factories. There was a furniture factory. This is the community center under construction. And this was what a typical house looked like. It had indoor plumbing. It had the most modern appliances. And it was certainly a change from what people had lived in before. And you can imagine how emotional people were when they were moved into places like this. Now, I will tell you that Arthurdale and the other communities that were established in this sort of utopian ideal were not necessarily a success. Arthurdale ran into financial problems almost immediately. General Electric had established a vacuum factory there, but then decided to pull out. The idea was that the people who lived, and they had many acres around each house, would grow crops to supplement their meager income. But many of these people didn't know how to do that. And so eventually, the houses had to be taken over by the government, and then eventually they were sold to the homesteaders, but it was not a financial success. You can visit Arthurdale. It is part of the National Historic Preservation Program that we have. And Eleanor Roosevelt realized that it hadn't quite turned out the way she wanted, but she said it was not only the economics, but the human values that were important in establishing a community like this. So Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't part of the brain trust of the New Deal. She didn't really sit down at a desk and write legislation. She wasn't part of that. But her role was just as important. When there was criticism of new laws, she would take to the country and talk about them, like Social Security. She would write in her columns. She defended the Federal Theaters Project because people thought it was too radical. So, and she would advocate, and she wasn't afraid to speak out when she saw something that she thought was glaringly wrong. For example, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. You heard about that a couple of weeks ago. Because the income of farmers was so rock bottom, so low, the idea here was for farmers to cut back on their production so prices would go up. Well, what do you do with 5 million baby pigs who are growing up to be pork when you don't want that to go on the market and flood prices? The answer is you kill them. So on the one hand, you had posters. America has plenty of food for everyone. Agricultural Adjustment Administration. On the other hand, you have photos like this one of cattle killed in North Dakota. Eleanor Roosevelt was beside herself. There are people who are starving in this country and we are destroying food. So she called up the head of the AAA and she said to him, "Why are you dumping all these pigs in the Mississippi River when there were thousands of people in the country who were starving?" Before he could reply, she said, "Why not give the meat away to these people?" And it was done. As one reporter said later, the surplus food and farm products were being fed to the hungry instead of being destroyed because she, meaning Eleanor Roosevelt, asked a government official a question. One reporter commented, "Of course, all the male officials are convinced they would have thought of it themselves." No, I'm not convinced of that. Eleanor Roosevelt had a different perspective, you see. I mean, she wasn't a government bureaucrat. She wasn't thinking in terms of numbers and dollars. She was thinking of people. And so, in a sense, this foreshadowed, the kind of farm program, food distribution program we have today. Now, all of this was possible because of this incredibly unusual relationship between these people. It was not a marriage in the traditional sense, for sure. It was a partnership. And as I've hammered home, Eleanor Roosevelt was not afraid to make suggestions, to give criticisms, to tell the truth, and to remind FDR that he had to live up to his campaign promises in case he forgot. Many people, including Rexford Tugwell, who was part of the Brain Trust and a very famous economist, remember being at their dinners. And Eleanor Roosevelt would put down her fork and say Franklin, and he would look up and she would capture his eyes and say, "Now, Franklin, don't you think?" Or, "Franklin, surely you will not." Their son recalled these conversations. Other people recalled these conversations. You couldn't get away from them. She flooded Roosevelt with written material, so much so that at one point he made a ruling 3 memos a day was the limit, only 3 memos a day. And there was a standard joke that went around the White House that Franklin Delano Roosevelt said at night, and it went this way, his prayer, nighttime prayer: "Dear God, please make Eleanor a little tired tomorrow." As for her part, this is what she said: "He might have been happier with a wife who had been completely uncritical. I was never going to be able to do that. Nonetheless, sometimes I think I acted as his spur and I served his purposes," unquote. It's interesting to think about that because I would suggest to you that she served his purposes specifically in the field of civil rights. All of you who know about the history of political parties realize that during the 1930s, a seismic shift happened in political loyalties. Since the Civil War, of course, Black Americans, those who could vote, voted Republican. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of emancipation. It was the party of anti-slavery. By contrast, after Reconstruction, the South was solidly Democratic. We called it the Solid South. In many states, like Florida, Republicans didn't even bother to put up candidates. I mean, it was the solid South Democratic, but it was a solid South full of segregationists. Segregation was the law of the land, Jim Crow was the law of the land, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt is head of a Democratic Party that's made up of Northern liberals and Northern factory workers and Southern segregationists. It's a party held together by Scotch tape. It's a patchwork, like many political parties are. And that meant he had to tread carefully, very carefully. One of the issues that he had spoken about while he was candidate and immediately after he was elected was this sad story of lynchings in the United States. I stand here ashamed to tell you that America was the lynching capital of the world. And lynchings, of course, were done by the thousands. There were thousands between the end of the Civil War and the 1930s, and you can see Florida. There were lynchings in California and Colorado, Wisconsin. And I am sure that all of you know that many of the African Americans who were lynched were innocent, but they were accused. It was a horrible, painful part of American history. Now, an anti-lynching bill had been introduced into Congress. And indeed, in the 1930s, it would pass the House a couple of times, but then it had to go to the Senate. And the Democrats in the Senate made it very clear to Roosevelt that they would not support his New Deal legislation if he pushed this anti-lynching bill. So FDR, like many politicians, shifted his views. He was afraid of Southern filibusters. He was afraid of not getting his New Deal program through. So he no longer spoke out about lynching, but Eleanor Roosevelt did. And she did, over and over again. She went to an exhibit that was sponsored by the NAACP that was called A Commentary on Lynching. She herself joined the NAACP. She spoke at Harlem's A&M Church, and she said, quote, "We should all have equal rights, and minorities should certainly have them exactly as the majority do." She favored the anti-lynching bill. She spoke for it. She could do it. FDR could not politically. Now, I stand here to tell you that we only got a federal anti-lynching bill in 2022. It took that long to get a federal anti-lynching bill that regarded lynching as a hate crime through the legislature. So she took a stand on lynching. And then she went to the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. It was held in Birmingham, Alabama in 1938, and there she is. There was supposedly an integrated session on labor relations that was going to be held in the municipal auditorium. But the newly elected public safety or police commissioner of Birmingham, Alabama, was none other than Bull Connor, who will become infamous during the 1960s. And he went to the municipal auditorium with his police and he told people, you have to separate. You cannot sit in an integrated fashion, blacks on one side, whites on the other. Eleanor Roosevelt arrived. She looked. She immediately went over to sit in the black section. A policeman came up to her and said, imagine saying this to the First Lady, you have to move or you'll be arrested. She took her chair and put it in the middle between the black and white section. Okay, a symbolic gesture. Symbolic gestures were important in the 1930s. So that was Eleanor Roosevelt. And one of the people she wanted to sit with at this conference was her good friend, Mary McLeod Bethune from Florida. They had met while Eleanor Roosevelt was a governor's wife. And they shared a love of education. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt had a school that she taught at before she became First Lady, Todd Hunter, and she was always interested in education. And she became very interested in what Mary McLeod Bethune had done. And they became close friends. Eleanor Roosevelt made sure that there were photographers present every time to take pictures as an example of interracial cooperation. There's a whole collection of photographs of Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, and they're wonderful. Eleanor Roosevelt came and visited Bethune-Cookman College. She came to Florida. She invited Mary McLeod Bethune to come visit her at the White House. And when Bethune arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt came out of the White House and greeted her. She made sure that everyone saw that. She was instrumental in suggesting that there be a black cabinet, that all the people who were serving in the Roosevelt administration of color get together on an informal basis and advise her on crucial issues. You will notice there is only one woman in this photograph, and that's Mary McLeod Bethune in the front. She was instrumental in getting Mary McLeod Bethune appointed as head of what was called the Negro Affairs Division in the NYA, the National Youth Administration, which had been so crucial to her. In 1937, Bethune organized a conference on the problems of Negro youth. And who was the keynote speaker? None other than First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. So their friendship was a true friendship. It was a very personal friendship. But Eleanor Roosevelt understood how important it was for the country to see this. And then, of course, Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was perhaps one of the most famous singers, contraltos that this country has ever produced. Arturo Toscanini said she had a voice of 1 in a million. There was nothing like her. She had had a time getting training, professional training, because the school she applied to, of course, did not accept people of color. But she was able to get training and had an incredibly successful career, which included a tour of Europe in which she was a sensation. Saul Hurok decided she should have a tour of the United States, and she did. She sang at the White House in 1935. You can see this photo. And then Howard University decided that wouldn't it be wonderful if she could give benefit concerts for our School of Music? And so she gave a series of benefit concerts for the School of Music, but they were so well attended that they outgrew the auditorium they were using. They needed a bigger venue. So first they applied to a high school, Central High School in Washington, D.C., which had a large auditorium. Washington, D.C. in the 1930s was a segregated city. And Central High School's Board of Education turned them down. So it was only natural that they would think of this building, Constitution Hall, which had been built by the Daughters of the American Revolution in the early 20th century, had an auditorium for 4,000, and there were many concerts and performances held there. But the Daughters of the American Revolution said no, because Marian Anderson was a person of color, and they were not going to allow their hall to be used by a person of color. Now, this became a big scandal. First of all, Eleanor Roosevelt was appalled. And she wrote to the head of Howard University. This is the actual telegram. I regret extremely that Washington is to be deprived of hearing Marian Anderson, a great artist. Then there was the DAR. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, even though she had not been active. And she decided she could not stay. And she wrote a letter to them with her resignation. And it might be a little hard for you to read, but if you go to the second paragraph, I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitution Hall to a great artist. You have set an example which seems to be unfortunate, and I feel obliged to send into you my resignation. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and your organization has failed. She also wrote about it in her My Day column. She didn't name the DAR, but she talked about what agony it was to belong to an organization whose policies you didn't agree with. Should you stay and try and bring about reforms from within, or should you resign? And she decided that you had to resign, otherwise you were giving your stamp of approval. So a group of people came together, including the NAACP and other groups, and they talked to the Secretary of the Interior with Eleanor Roosevelt's blessing and encouragement, and it was arranged for Marian Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Day in 1939. There she is, before a crowd of 75,000 people and millions more listening to her on the radio. I read recently an interview with a very prominent Black journalist, and he talked about how important this was, getting Marian Anderson in front of the Lincoln Memorial and what it meant about Eleanor Roosevelt's role. So in terms of civil rights, she was outspoken. There's no doubt about it. And it definitely helped Black Americans change their allegiance to the Democratic Party. Just a few months after the concert, there's Eleanor Roosevelt presenting Marian Anderson with the highest medal from the NAACP, the Spingarn Medal. And of course, Marian Anderson went on to sing Everywhere, and the Daughters of the American Revolution in a decade changed their policies. So, what can we say about Eleanor Roosevelt and the New Deal? Well, I've got a couple of quotes here that I like. William T. Youngs, who's written a book on Eleanor Roosevelt, has this to say: simply by taking the side of the underdog, whether in sponsoring Arthur Dale or identifying herself with oppressed blacks, she created a feeling among millions of Americans that someone in high office cared about their condition. In various ways, she interested Franklin in her issues. She brought Southern sharecroppers and Northern garment factory workers to the White House. She arranged his social schedule so that at dinner he would sit next to representatives of minorities and laborers. Franklin sometimes used Eleanor's care for the needy to his own advantage. Through her influence, he won votes with disadvantaged groups while keeping more neutral himself. But often he bent to her will, showing an interest in measures she brought to his attention. Never get into an argument with the missus, he told Lorena Hickok. You can't win. You think you have her pinned down here, but she bobs up right away over there somewhere. No use. You can't win. Presidential advisor Harry Hopkins: I never cease to admire Eleanor's burning determination to see that justice is done. Katie Martin, who's written a book about power couples in the White House in the 20th century, has said, quote, partly because of her own feelings of being an outsider to her own society, this high-born woman identified with the deprived and disenfranchised, not as Lady Bountiful, but as one of them. And Eleanor Roosevelt herself wrote, quote, the unemployed are not a strange race. They are like we would be if we had not had a fortunate chance at life. So if Franklin Roosevelt was the head of the New Deal, she was the heart and soul. And I will close with one of my favorite quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt herself. A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong she is until she's in hot water.
Thank you, Barbara. That was wonderful. We all learned a lot today, didn't we? Are there any questions?
Sure. It's good.
Larry Lowenthal. I remember a line from John Kennedy's eulogy of Eleanor, and it resonated with me then and since. Said she would rather light a candle than curse the darkness. So I always carry a match with me.
Yeah. He has a lot of wonderful, wonderful quotes. But I like the tea bag one, and I actually have a button with it on.
Any other questions, comments?
There's one on the front row.
I've read a great deal about not the New Deal specifically, but about the conditions of 1930. And it seems to me that what we're lacking in this series is perhaps the socio-political aspects of the extreme disruption of the Depression. 2 weeks ago, public television on their American Experience program series, had a documentary called Nazi Town, USA. And apparently the center of this Nazi movement that the Roosevelt administration shut down in 1934 was a naturalized, quote unquote, German citizen who came here in the late 20s and organized and became the emotional Trump-like leader of this Nazi movement. They even had children's camps. And these people were not with the poor and downtrodden. These were middle-class people. So I'm just asking what you know about this.
Well, there were, of course, a number of anti-democratic movements in the 1930s. There were people like Father Coughlin. There were other people who were promising economic utopias if we did such and such. And of course, there was a German-American Bund in this country from the middle 1930s on. So I unfortunately did not see the American Experience. I have it on my list, but it doesn't surprise me, Phyllis. But I think that's a very interesting topic that we perhaps don't address, that there were all these cracks in the system during the 1930s and people were susceptible to various kinds of ideas that were extreme. One historian I heard talk about this said if there had been any revolution in the 1930s, a violent revolution, it would have come from the farmers. I thought to myself, the farmers, you know, and he had a lot of proof to show there were radical groups among farming communities that were armed not just with pitchforks, you know, that they were desperate because the bottom had fallen out of the farming market. So, yeah, I think that's a very good point. You could also couple it with the psychological impact of the Great Depression on families, because in my own family, there was an effort to give one child away because they couldn't afford to take care of all the children. So they could maybe give one child away to an aunt and uncle who had no children. Then there are the millions of people who rode the rails and became hobos, you know, going from one town to another. The psychological impact on the people at the top, you know, suddenly being at the bottom, the suicide rate. You know, there were all kinds of things. It's a very interesting perspective. Thank you for bringing it up.
Barbara, one of the interesting stories to me is her flying with a black pilot who was part of the Tuskegee Airmen. I think his name was Charles Anderson. And, you know, flying was not that common at that time. And what it must have taken for her to go there and fly in a plane with a black flight instructor. Could you make some comments about what you know about that story?
Well, I didn't include it because it's after World War II, you know, after we enter World War II. But the Tuskegee Airmen trained and trained and trained, and many of them had been pilots before, and they weren't getting sent into combat. And Eleanor Roosevelt was told about it, and so she went and had photos taken and did fly with a black pilot, and there is a photograph of her with him. And afterwards, lo and behold, they were assigned to Europe, and I forget the name of the division, but they came away with all kinds of medals. They flew mostly escort around American bombers, and they had an incredible career. But yes, she brought publicity to that, and that's the kind of thing she did. Yeah, and she, by the way, she loved flying. You can find ads in, I think, Life magazine. Eleanor Roosevelt for getting on an airplane. She loved it.
Got a question on chat.
Okay, John Reiskin, why don't you go ahead with your hand up?
What a wonderful talk and angles that I never knew about. But I happened to visit the Roosevelt Library last summer, and there's an exhibit that opened last July on the civil rights and the New Deal. And I just posted on the chat the link to that exhibit. And it is so fascinating. The exhibit includes recordings of conversations between FDR and leaders in the Black community that were recorded at the time, but never released at the time. It's just a fascinating exhibit of the frustration that he experienced and that Eleanor, as you pointed out so beautifully, cut right through. So thank you so much.
Thanks, John, for that. I look forward to looking at that link.
And then there's a chat that says, did Eleanor express her feelings about racial disparity? Any action attributed to her influence?
Can you repeat that? It's
Did Eleanor express her feelings about racial disparity?
priorities, yeah.
Any action attributed to her influence?
There was
So
a question
she did-
asked before you.
She did express her influence about racial disparities in terms of economics. Remember, there was that quote that she felt everybody should have equal opportunity. And I think she felt she was helping through programs like the National Youth Administration, which helped a number of young Black people. So yes, in that sense, but yes, she was very conscious of it. Mary McLeod Bethune bent her ear about that, and there's no doubt, yes, she was conscious of it. I cannot point to a specific piece of legislation that's directed at that, but part of the reason for the shift of Black Americans to the Democratic Party is that although some of the programs were really segregated, Black Americans, because they were at the bottom, benefited from the programs anyway. And of course, she was very important in making sure that once we went to war, that the war industries would not discriminate. There was a planned march on Washington in the summer of 1941, huge. It was going to be absolutely huge, protesting discrimination in war factories. And it's partially Eleanor Roosevelt who worked out the negotiation with leaders of the march and convinced her husband to issue an executive order banning discrimination in war factories. So those would be the main things.
Thank you again, Barbara. This is wonderful. Next week, we'll wrap up the New Deal course. Donna Waller will be coming back. You remember Donna spoke to us in the first lecture, talking about the roots of the progressive programs that found their way into the New Deal. And Barbara will come back to talk about the legacy of the New Deal. So with that, we'll say thank you, and we'll see you next week.
But, okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you.